here's the truth, here's how this works. And by the way, this waste is actually just unspent fuel that probably gets used. And to think that human ingenuity hasn't solved this, it has. We have solved how to do all of this stuff, right?
Yep.
So what I'm most excited about is a recognition of that we need a growth mentality, an abundance mentality. The earth can support everything we need to do with the population we have and a growing population if you let it. And this is literally energy from the gods, right? The uranium was created with two neutron stars colliding, and you don't want to use it? Can you imagine how ridiculous that is?
Yeah.
So here we are.
Excellent.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
Of course, the world cannot meet it without America.
that is willing
But
to
we're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the
overhaul
job.
nuclear regulation
We need scientists to design new
and
fuels.
focus on net public
We need
benefit
engineers to invent new technologies. We
over absurd levels of radiation
need
protection,
entrepreneurs to sell those
then
technologies.
we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech,
we
zero-carbon
have
components.
unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Welcome to another episode of the Fire Division podcast, where we discuss the development and utilization of energy-dense fuels and how they can better human lives. We've got two great guests today, Rishi Jain, Managing Director of Business Development at Cross River Infrastructure Partners, and Paul Murphy, Managing Director of Nuclear at Cross River Infrastructure Partners. Rishi, Paul, how are you guys doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. I might have you go individually for folks that are just listening to introduce yourselves, including your name, so that we can clarify who Paul and who Rishi is. So, Paul, why don't you start?
Sure. So thanks for having me, Paul Murphy. As you said, Managing Director for Nuclear for Cross River. My background is in project finance and energy and infrastructure. For the majority of my career, I've been on the legal side of things, helping to develop and finance projects. And that's very much in many ways consistent with my role at Cross River, focusing on our nuclear efforts and looking at it from the project development and financing side.
Awesome. How about you, Rishi?
Yeah, my name is Rishi Jain. I'm one of the partners here at Cross River. I lead our business development, as mentioned. My background is, and the other partners, we come from the investment side of the world. My own background was focused a lot on energy and natural resources, also industrials. And really, this is probably your next question, but how did we come to form Cross River and really where we're playing? There was a recognition when you look at the world of finance and funding. When you look at venture capital, they're really good at taking technology risk, really terrible business model and structure for capital intensity. When you look at project finance and infrastructure capital, really love capital intensity, really terrible at new technologies and often new markets. And so you have this very big gap when you think about technologies that are, let's call them 21st century technologies that are industrial in nature. How do you, if you have a technology that's commercially ready for deployment, how do you get that out there? And really, if you are plant and equipment, let's say your plant requires $100-200 million in, and there's a balance of plant and there's a whole bunch of project development that has to happen around it. Typically, technology developers are not project developers, right? And they're really good at tech development. They're not so versed in how do you get something so that other people's money feels comfortable in taking your project on. And so that's really how we approach this. We started partnering with technologies that had high capital intensity needs and said, okay, well, how do we bring institutional capital, whether that's strategic or financial, into the space that has lower development maturity? So when you look at solar and wind, those are commoditized products, hundreds of different developers out there of all sorts of shapes and sizes, thousands, if not more, that know what they're doing, and you have limited returns on those projects. When you think about nuclear as an example, there is no nuclear developer out there, right? There's certainly, even the GEs and the strategics of the world have long lost the ability to develop a project. And so we sat there and said, well, we have a view on nuclear being absolutely essential to the decarbonization of the world, and the physics of it just making the most sense for the planet that we live in and the realities we have to deal with. How do we get involved in this? And we've been involved in the nuclear fuel cycle and upstream, et cetera, but how do we get involved? And so that's what led us to our partnership and our project in New Brunswick, which we could talk about.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll try and summarize for myself and hopefully our listeners, but you said venture capital often struggles to be a project developer, but they're comfortable taking big bets on technology. And then established or incumbent infrastructure companies are comfortable taking big bets on capital, but aren't good with new technology. And so you guys have kind of identified a niche to marry those two ideas and bridge that gap. So that's awesome. Okay, well, I appreciate that overview of kind of Cross River. Did it start out with that thesis? Was there something before the infrastructure partners piece?
We had pivoted a few different times in getting to this correct business model, or business model that is now correct. And it started with partnering with other developers and providing, if you want to call the non-technical wrap around a project. And often those developers would have a relationship or a technology that was interesting, or which we thought we could build something around. We sort of soon, over a couple of different versions of partnerships, we realized that even when you're partnered with a developer and you sort of say, look, guys, this is not the way to do this, it's not going to work, and then they still do it, you don't have any control over stopping them from doing it. So we finally said, we just need to take control of this whole situation. And so while Andrew Wilder, our CEO, and myself are not technical, we're financial and operational types, we bring in the right skill sets as we find a program which we believe we can develop. So fundamentally, we build the business of a project, right? Which is what a developer does. And our technical partners will deal with the technical aspects. So in this case, on the nuclear side, we're partnered with Arc Clean Technology. They are the 100 to 300 megawatt variant of the EVR2 married to the GE Prism. And NB Power in New Brunswick, Canada, selected them as part of the Stream 2 of Canada's SMR program, which Paul actually helped author. And they take care of the technical parts, and we start filling in the balance. So we, Paul was one of those pieces that we had to fill in. Very well connected in the nuclear space. He's doing a bunch of work with the DOE, Department of Commerce, civilian nuclear programs. He's got a project finance background, possibly the only nuclear project finance background in the world, which up until our project probably was a very lonely space to be, but now we're letting him unfurl his wings and be the butterfly.
That's great, and probably a good segue. So Paul, how'd you get connected with these guys, and what's been your role?
Well, back to my legal side, the general counsel of Cross River is a gentleman by the name of David Robbins. When I was at White & Case early in my legal career as a mid-level and senior associate, David was a partner. We worked together. We maintained a relationship over the years. And lo and behold, one day I got a call from David and said, hey, we could use some help on the nuclear side. And it's grown ever since. And I think a lot of the things that Rishi's hit on attracted me to Cross River because, what you see in the nuclear space, and having done stuff all over the world, working with large reactors, small reactors, the vendors consistently have this statement, I just want to be a vendor. That is my business. Yep. And that's great. As a project finance lawyer, I sit there and say, wonderful, but that's not a project. So who's putting the project together? And you really just don't see that in the nuclear space, other than some large utilities doing it for themselves. And even then, depending on what they've done recently, there could be some issues there too. But that sort of expertise to pull all the elements together and to do it in a way that makes sense, that's economically viable, that's sort of where the challenge has been. And I'd been talking about it, presenting about it. So it sort of became Well, here's where you better put up or shut up. Here's the opportunity to get involved with the group that's doing it. So you've been talking about it. You might as well get involved and roll up your sleeves. And it is a perfect time because I think for the industry where you see the money that's been coming in, there's been a lot of money that's come in, but it's all been into technology investment. I'm going to invest in reactor design X or Y or Z, but not flowing into the projects themselves. And I think we're kind of at this inflection point where we've been in this technology development stage, which is obviously essential, but now we have to be moving into project delivery. Because if we want to see the industry meet the needs of development, decarbonization, energy security, all these cool applications that SMRs can do, hydrogen production, desalination, pick your topic, we've got to actually start delivering projects. And I think that that's what we're seeing, not just with what we're doing up at Belledune, but in working with ARC. ARC is continuing to progress on the technology development side. And then you're seeing the transition for what they're doing at LaPro with NB Power and then with us at Belledune. And so you see that evolution into the project development and delivery space. But that's where we really have to get cracking as an industry on delivering the projects, not just the first ones, but scaling it quickly. Because when you look at where the industry is in the SMR space, you're seeing the various vendors, and we can mention them, of course, all targeting like late end of this decade for the first one. And then you look at your 2040 or 2050 targets, and so you're like this, and then all of a sudden it's got to go like that. And so you sort of sit there and say, how's that supposed to happen? And that gets into supply chain issues. It gets into a lot of things. But having real projects to point to for investors, for the supply chain, for governments, showing that pipeline is critical. Like when I was at Bechtel earlier in my career, we were partnering with Areva to bid for large reactors at the Darlington project. And there was a requirement that you needed a certain percentage from the Canadian supply chain. And the Canadian supply chain is very experienced. But when we went to people, they didn't have the capacity because they were full, and they didn't want to expand their capacity because they said, well, what happens if the project never occurs? And of course, it never occurred. So they were right. But that is one of those challenges, is getting that investment into the sector is a function of a lot of different things. But one of them is not, hey, I have this really cool technology and my reactor is better than yours kind of debate. It's who cares? What's your project pipeline? And so when you
how are you going to make money? Who are you going to sell to?
And so like, okay, multiple reactors at LaPro for ARC. For us at Belledune, we're talking a gigawatt. That's a pipeline. That's something you can start scaling a supply chain and developing human resources to support it. And I think that's where it gets very exciting for us, because we see the project helping pull the technology forward. We all have our part to do, but that project pipeline, I think, is really critical. And so a very long-winded Irish-Italian lawyer answer to a very simple question: how did I get involved with Cross River? But there you go.
Oh, that's perfect. I love it. I love that both of you identified or articulated this gap in the industry. I've identified it too, coming from kind of the upstream oil and gas space. All of the oil companies aren't technology developers, right? They're general contractors. They go out and they utilize the technology, and that, in my opinion, that doesn't exist in the nuclear space. And it's a huge opportunity. And I mean, at this point in the game, I think there's lots of space for lots of players, but yeah, I've had the same perspective that all of the technology developers kind of have the field of dreams view of, if you build it, they will come. But that's not necessarily how the world works. There's a lot of work that goes into actually selling these things on these projects. So exciting to hear that you guys have that thesis. And yeah, let's dig into kind of one of the current projects that you guys are working on.
Sure. So Belledune is the first project that we are proposing to be nuclear industrial production hub. Belledune is an industrial port on the north shore of New Brunswick, Canada. The province is for our American listeners, if you drive straight across the border from Maine, you're in New Brunswick. And it is not New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is an inexplicable number of times I've had to make that clarification. So this is the province of New Brunswick. There's an industrial port that has, like many regions in the US and other parts of Canada, was a formerly industrial zone that has, against its will, deindustrialized with a lot of offshoring, a lot of low-cost production labor in other parts of the world. The port and its CEO, Denis Caron, embarked on a redevelopment plan, a master redevelopment plan 2 or 3 years ago to reimagine the port as a green energy hub and to utilize what is a beautiful federal asset that is not being used. It's a deep water, all-weather port that has significant capacity available to attract green energy and reindustrialize the economy in the region in the 21st century into the 22nd century model. Now, New Brunswick is a nuclear province. There is a coal plant that is going to be decommissioned by 2030 that is at the port, which means while the coal plant, we all have our views on how coal needs to disappear, but the interconnection, the infrastructure, the cooling, it's all there. And that is a significant advantage, the transmission especially. So that site is where we're going to locate, or we're proposing to locate, the ARC SMRs for hydrogen production. And in our view, and it's a minimum of 1 gigawatt, but probably closer to 2 gigawatts of ARC technology we'll put there. And New Brunswick, very appreciatively, as well as the First Nations, have all made and are all supporting and have made a big bet on the ARC technology behind NB Power doing their global down select. And there's bipartisan support in this province for nuclear. And then there's bipartisan support federal level as well, which is awesome to have a stable environment where you don't have this fear of partisanship, bickering, tearing apart our program. There is consensus that this must happen. And it is likely that nuclear gets added as part of Canada's green taxonomy. That seems to be the way that's going. And in fact, I think most places around the world will view nuclear as green, other than Germany, which has a very different story that we don't need to talk about.
And Colorado, but we can talk
Colorado,
about that
and Minnesota too, inexplicably.
yeah,
Here
it's
we
bizarre.
are. So
yeah, we're changing that. Part of this podcast will change that, right? So.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I think what will happen is anyone who takes the bet that New Brunswick is doing over the next 50 years, you're going to see business, heavy industry attracted to where low price clean energy is. And on pound for pound, or gigawatt for gigawatt, megawatt for megawatt, there isn't anything cheaper. Even new build nuclear, even when you look at Vogtle, is still cheaper than the equivalent amount of unsubsidized solar and wind, or variable renewable from a system level basis. Now,
which is how we should think about it.
Which is right. The total system level cost of electricity or energy is how we pay for power, right? That's what shows up on our bill. So it's fine that you keep these constructs of, oh, well, just a project, even though solar panel costs are going up and wind turbine costs are going up, they're not cheap anymore. That whole Chinese labor and no labor standards, no environmental standards, that world that has run its course, you're never going to get better, cheaper, denser power. And we have gone through, when we went through ARC's technology, we are not venture capitalists. So the fact that a nuclear operator went through and said, this is the technology we're going to go through. And then when we had our technology briefing with them, we did another one in December, our jaws just dropped at how
so maybe let's clarify some of these entities and organizations. So the location that you selected for a nuclear deployment is in New Brunswick. It's at a private port, I assume?
No. So it's a federally, it's a federal port authority. Yeah. And so I'll clarify a little bit further. So New Brunswick Power is the utility. They currently operate a CANDU reactor at Point Lepreau in the south, which is just north of Maine.
A different location than where you guys look at.
They have decided to take the first of a kind, or I should say first in a while risk.
Sure.
And order units 1, possibly 2, 3, and 4.
Because they have an existing power demand. And they have a coal plant that's closing. They need to replace that power with something else.
They have to decarbonize in general. They're at 80-ish% roughly, but they got to get to the rest of the way. And they are looking at this as a development opportunity because the units will be assembled in New Brunswick. So there's an economic benefit here. New England obviously is a mess in terms of its grid. And so you have an opportunity to really take advantage of power pricing there as well. And then, of course, the ARC units produce an immense amount of heat, and as do fourth generation in general. And that heat is where what we got very excited about. So we said, all right, so ARC, from a financing standpoint, you have a nuclear operator. You've got them saying we're going to take at least the first unit, possibly the first 4 units. That is something that we can then build on. And of course, Paul, as a project finance lawyer, can tell you these are the elements you need in place in order to have a successful project financing to attract third-party capital. Right? If you don't have an operator, what does it matter? You be able to get your right. You get your
so maybe give us a little bit more background on ARC for those unfamiliar. I mean, you said you were excited about the technology. Your jaw dropped again. Who are these guys? What's the tech?
Paul maybe is. Why not? Go ahead.
I mean, I think, taking almost a step back, when you look at the number of SMR, advanced reactor, microreactor developers just in North America, 60, 70, if you throw fusion on there, there's so many out there. And so, which in some sense is very exciting. Teach for Texas A&M, a graduate program that they do on a bunch of issues, and I do a segment on SMRs, and I throw up a picture of all the dots where everybody's located. And I say, as a nuclear engineering student, that's exciting, right? That's a good thing. But unfortunately, they're not all going to survive. And so you put on your financing hat and you start to triage them all. And it's an imperfect process, but you say, what are the touch points that make this seem like it has a chance of success? And when you do that with ARC, the ARC design is based on the EBR2, which ran for 3 decades at Idaho National Lab. So there's one point. You have, the relationship with NB Power. There are these 3 tracks in the SMR program in Canada. This is one of the tracks. And so not only is it a track, but it's at an existing nuclear site with an operator. And so you put those things together and you say, well, that looks pretty good. And then when you look at what we're trying to do at Belledune, where we're doing it as nuclear enabled blank, it's not, the primary purpose is not to just put electricity on the grid, it's to produce hydrogen and ammonia and maybe do other interesting things with hydrogen at the port as well. And you say, well, what makes sense for that purpose? And as Rishi mentioned, the high heat factor gives us a benefit that others don't have. So it's not to say, well, across every factor, ARC is the best in everything, but it's the best for us and in the province where they're already developing. And so when you're looking to de-risk a project development effort, you want to have those core factors. And that's where for us, it all fits together and makes sense because of the unique characteristics around ARC, its technological lineage. And then when you get even more on the project side, what gets exciting for us is we can message the project differently depending on our audience. So when you're talking to the Canadian government about its SMR roadmap, well, clearly we're in that as a new nuclear development project. Well, Canada also has a hydrogen strategy, so we can talk to it on that. And then the port needs development. This is really important for the province and for Atlantic Canada in terms of a project of this scale and all that it comes with it. And so it's a development project, which also you're talking jobs, economic benefit, all those things that is also very important. So you have different touch points that I think in nuclear, we have to be very conscious of stakeholder engagement and messaging. And of course, one of the things we haven't touched on, but the port has an excellent relationship with the First Nations in the area and their support. The press releases that have been put out, we've had the First Nations on those press releases, which is hugely important. I once, going back about 5 or 6 years, I gave a presentation to a US audience about doing projects in Canada. And I said, if you think Native American relations are important in the US, multiply that by 10 and that's Canada. And that means you have to invest the time and get that right, but they can be really important partners for the development of the project as well. And so I think from a technology perspective, from a location perspective, we have these things to build on that help set the project apart. And coming all the way back to the question, that I think is for us what sets ARC apart for Canada. Even though Cross River is a US company, ARC is ultimately a US company. ARC has ARDP funding from the Department of Energy. So the US is a very important market for ARC as well. But I think Canada presents some unique opportunities because of the SMR roadmap, because of something we haven't really talked about yet, but the regulatory structure in Canada, where you're in the US, it's prescriptive. And in Canada, you're talking a more performance-based approach, which when you're in the new technology space, that approach is really helpful because, especially when you're looking at multiple technologies, it's a bit of a challenge to write prescriptive guidance for every different technology, whereas performance results oriented, I think, is suitable. And going back to that INL history with EBR2, ARC has all the data from that. And so when you're working with the regulator, it's not just saying, well, I think this works and here's why, but no, ours actually worked and we're just scaling it up to go from the size that EBR2 was to the size we're going to use at LaPro and Belledune. Scaling an engineer, and I'm not an engineer would say scale is not just math. There are technical issues that arise, of course, but the fact that you have the design with all that operating history, I think, is a real confidence building measure for us when we think about what we need for the project, but also as we engage with the Canadian government, the provincial government, the First Nations, other investors as well. Really important pedigree for the overall project.
That's awesome. Lots of detail there. So the EBR2, that was the experimental breeder reactor, right? That, like you said, functioned for 30 years. So it's not like it's new technology, but they may repurpose it and perhaps scaling it up from the experimental design. But provides multiple potential profit streams, or not just one utilization of selling electrons, but yeah, operates at perhaps a higher temperature than some light water or CANDU designs. And so you can.
Yeah, that's right. What we're going to be doing is when you look at electrolysis of hydrogen, 30 to 50% of the power usage of an electrolyzer is simply heating up the water. And so if you can just have heated water already with no energy penalty, which is what happens with a reactor, how can any level of gargantuan solar and wind only system ever compete with that? It's not possible.
It can't. Yeah.
Right.
And the hydrogen's an interesting play.
In the space of Costco's. Like we'll put 2 gigawatts in the space of 2 Costco's. I mean, how is that? How can you beat that?
Yeah, that's awesome. The hydrogen's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Canada has some mandates around hydrogen, and there's been some studies done about, okay, can we get it from Europe? Will Europe be shipping it? And I've seen some, I'll say, hobbyist engineers have put analysis together that demonstrate that that's just ludicrous, and the efficiencies of trying to grab or ship hydrogen from somewhere in Europe over.
It's actually going to be the reverse. It's shipping to Europe.
Right, you'll be shipping to Europe. Yeah.
The world in the last year, as we all know, has faced an unprecedented series of shocks. Right, the Russian invasion has upended the energy world, and civilization is dependent on energy. So it's upended every facet of everyone's life everywhere on the planet. And that is something that's short of a world war has never happened, right? In this regard, where to so many people simultaneously.
Certainly for like our generation, right? I mean,
Well, right. But if you just think about the sheer number of people on the planet that this is affecting, nothing else has affected so many people simultaneously, right? As this energy shock. And that is crazy, right? So when you think about, how, for instance, how Germany got itself into a position to be dependent on Russian gas is another long podcast, but it did. And Northern Europe is at risk of massive deindustrialization while they're trying to decarbonize simultaneously. You have an energy shock. How do you deal with that? Well, you're not going to use your clean electrons. It doesn't make sense to use your clean electrons to produce fuel when it should be used for the electricity you need to get off of the coal that you're now massively burning because you don't have the natural gas. So there are a whole bunch of dynamics at play here, which one is trying to figure out in real time, and everyone has an opinion on. Every time we reanalyze how we're doing this, we keep coming back to the nuclear hydrogen is what makes the most sense. The question is, does the hydrogen get shipped in as, for instance, as ammonia to Europe? Or do you use it locally and produce a higher value product? For instance, direct reduction iron is something we're following up on very closely. There are other metals that can be reduced with hydrogen because that's just what hydrogen does, it binds. And so there's a lot of possible development and a lot of deindustrialization. But even, for instance, if we do a direct reduction iron plant or a steel plant, there are heat requirements in these processes. They're endothermic processes that either you're burning some energy or you're consuming something for energy, or if you can get it from a reactor, then you can drop your costs of production there as well. And so that's what is so exciting about creating industrial clusters. And we can't talk about any names, but we are, and Paul has really been spearheading this because of his connectivity. People are looking at our Belgian model from around the world, and the reaction is, wait a minute, we would like to do this here.
Yeah.
And so we are in the
Absolutely.
process of a bunch of, which is incredible.
Well, it kind of competes with LNG export terminals, right? I mean, you think about the amount of natural gas resource that's trapped in the eastern United States and they can't get to market because there's no LNG export terminals. But then you guys found a port that you can build a nuclear reactor on and export hydrogen, which is an energy carrier, just like natural gas. And yeah, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
you
to be
see.
clear,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Paul. Before I just want to put this out there, we are engaging in early consultation work with the communities and the First Nations. So let us not presuppose that this is a fait accompli. We have a long process here that includes the licensing regime, but so far the reaction has been
that's the target. Yeah,
that is the target.
Thanks, Rishi.
We are not imposing this on anybody. In partnership.
I think, Mark, what's important in all of this is you see two, I think, extreme forcing functions that have arisen in the last few years. For someone that's been in this industry for a while and saw the nuclear renaissance in the 2000s that really didn't happen, and then sort of a lull and now a comeback, I think it's really being driven by two things. Forget all the people that like nuclear and actually understand nuclear and why it makes sense. That they've always been there, but I think the two forcing functions are climate change / decarbonization, net zero, whatever label you want to put on it, and just the simple math of you can't get there without nuclear. It's not to say that renewables are bad, but you just need too much of it, and you can't get there with the intermittency. You need lots of it. And that's where nuclear comes in. And I think as more and more people have come around to that recognition and seeing the math of it all, that's been a driving force. And I think the other thing is, as Rishi touched upon, energy security. I've been giving presentations for years, and I always used to talk about the intangibles of nuclear. And one of them in that list was energy security. And you would sort of mention it and no one would care. And you just move on, even though you're like, well, it's true. But then a lot of these points people could debate and take different views, but we've seen over the last even more than a year, because we saw already prices going up in Europe in advance of February 24th, 2022. And again, it's just reality has hit. You can ignore reality. You can say, oh, something else should work. But then when it doesn't, it doesn't. And I think that energy security and decarbonization, and then you throw on top of it, you look at somebody like a BASF in Germany who's saying, we're shutting down because the price is too expensive. The reliability isn't there. You're telling me I can't use the dirty stuff, and I don't want to use the dirty stuff because I want to I got to shut down and go somewhere. And so crazy. And again, I think for a lot of these companies that are a business, they want stable electricity. They don't necessarily need the cheapest at all times. I mean, they're not going to complain if it's cheap, but they want to know I can get this for a long time at a stable price so that I can model my business off of that. And what's happened is that that's gotten thrown completely out of whack. And so as you start thinking about new ways to think of energy, and kind of almost in this concept of critical infrastructure, in modern society, we just need it. The lights have to go on. Or for a business, they just need to know that they can run all the time. And when you throw on energy security and decarbonization, like, these projects have a huge opportunity, whether it's ours or others, to deliver electricity to the grid, electricity for end use, other products that are part of the production cycle, like a hydrogen, like an ammonia, all these things that are going to drive the economy and industry. And where those can be produced, you're going to see industries reconfigure along those lines. And that means jobs and economics and all those good things, and tax base and all of that stuff.
Awesome. I think you guys answered one of my questions, which was, do we think these projects will be developed in the US and internationally? Sounds like you've had some discussions and conversations with folks that have interest, and certainly the ARDP supporting ARC demonstrates the US should want to invest in this.
I mean, just Mark, real quick on that. I think it underscores the importance of government and all of this too, and providing support. Yes, we have to scale, but we've got to get these first projects done early on. And you can see some of the numbers with the investment tax credits and production tax credits in the United States and how transformative those can be. I mean, CERAWeek just happened and all the oil and gas companies are talking about that, right? So you see how government support, whether it's at the regulatory level or just at the early stages, to facilitate things and to kind of just signal the market that the government is supportive of this, so that it enables companies like ours to then do what we can do. And you hear the term public-private partnership, you think of it at a project level, and it can be that, but it almost goes broader than that. It's a recognition that having that government support can be critical, and not for all time. It's at these early stages to get the technologies developed, get these first projects going, show that it can be done. Because as you just touched upon, as we're talking about our project in Canada, we're already getting interest from other players to say, hey, we would like that too. And that's exciting, because that's how you get the scaling that we all hope for, not just as our business, but for the things we really need to do to decarbonize.
As we were working on this project, actually, we were expecting policy support around the hydrogen, and Canada announced that. But in the same breath, they announced 30% investment tax credit for SMRs, which came out, which was so unexpected.
Thank you.
That we said this is incredible. You know, that this is on there, and I think it's got bipartisan support. So to Paul's point, and I think I say this as a reformed libertarian, there is a very real role for government in initiating the real move towards new technologies, both on a carrot and stick perspective.
Gotcha. Well, that half answers one of my questions, which is where will the capital come from to support these projects? And it sounds like your guys' view is some of the seed capital, if you could view it that way, could be government support, right? Or government incentives or public-private partnerships.
It all requires private capital to be there, and so that's where.
So what are some of the private sources that you guys do?
It's strategic. It's both the technology company itself, like ARC, has their funding rounds, and so these early development activities are very accretive uses of equity capital, right? Because this is forming your business for its future big way, and ensuring that you have orders coming. We have our own partners and such strategics who have expressed a strong interest in participating. They certainly they want to see that there is government policy support, right? So that they're not taking all of the early risk by themselves, for sure. But no one's sitting there saying, okay, just make this government funded, because I think everyone recognizes, one, especially in the post-pandemic world, their government balance sheets are not in any shape to be doing that. And I think that for some reason in North America, you sort of even though we pride ourselves on being very capitalist, people have become addicted to government doing everything, right? Whereas in France, you've got,
I
and in
couldn't
Europe,
agree more. Yeah.
public-private partnerships are how their infrastructure is built. For some reason, I mean, government is terrible at building things, absolutely awful at bridges and tunnels and roads. Why are they doing that? And real estate and everything. I mean, they're awful at it. So there's a recognition that cannot be, it feels like there's a recognition that can't be the model going forward, and nor do they want it to be the model going forward.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So nuclear typically has a long lead time, but what's the timeline target perhaps for the New Brunswick project? And in your guys' view, what does perhaps the timeline need to be for project development in the space?
So this is, for us, Beldoon is a multi-phased project. There's an initial pilot, commercial pilot, that then is going to be expanded to, if you will say, an enormous size by the nuclear. So we're already moving forward on that first phase, which is going to be powered by wind and hydro, new wind and new hydro in line with whatever rules are in Europe. But what that does is it sets up the power buyer as, because otherwise you're doing several mega projects simultaneously, and that's not really feasible unless you're in the Middle East or in China or something. We are setting up an earlier phase, which is going to start production in 2027. The first reactors are slated at Point Lepreau, I believe, by 2029, early 2030s. 2029 is when we expect that to go in. Our plan is for the first reactor to hit COD at Beldoon in 2031, and then we'll be rolling 2 a year across 5 years, or if we expand it to 2 gigawatts.
And part of that is really important, because for us, we want to take the learnings from what they're doing at Lepreau and move it over into our project. So you think about something like preparing an operating license application. Well, it's the same technology, the same operator. How difficult is it going to do the second operating license application? And that's where we can leverage things, but you need to have that stagger. And I think that having the first phase, I think that's one of the things that we're seeing too in the market is people liking this two-phase model, because from a government perspective, if people start hearing, well, 2030s, they're like, but I want to see stuff happening now. We need to get into this area now, and we want to show activity now. Well, now in nuclear is different than how most people think of now, but having that first phase to come in and help to develop the port and get things going, I think is unique to our approach, but it's getting great receptivity in the market, which is exciting for us.
I know we're coming close to our time here, so I did want to point one thing out about new nuclear in the US as an example. In the RTOs, the quote unquote deregulated grids, which are often even more regulated and cumbersome than
a disaster. Yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous. But using ISO New England as an example, right? If you are just facing the grid as a new nuclear plant, the way these rules, which are upside down and they favor the heavily subsidized intermittent first, and you're not being rewarded for resiliency, and you're sort of being treated apples to apples, which is insane. You're not apples to apples. You're something that sometimes works in a very sporadic way versus always works and doesn't have emissions. So if you're trying to build a new nuclear plant and that's your business model, it's probably not going to happen in an RTO, which is huge swaths of the US, right? That's California, that's PJM, that's ISO New England, that's Texas, ERCOT. You really can't compete very easily. But if you are producing something else and you're only being called upon as a capacity, and you're getting a capacity payment when there's stress, then you can make a bunch of money on those stress periods, because the electrolysis can be turned off in a minute, right? Most of our plant, even at 400, 500 megawatts, gigawatt and a half, most of those electrolyzers can be turned off in a minute. And you can suddenly,
and the remainder of the time you're making hydrogen or producing another product. Yeah.
So for New Brunswick, what we'll be doing there, New Brunswick is not a deregulated market, but the idea is to provide capacity to New Brunswick Power as the grid operator, because they have a winter peaking system, as does Quebec, and hydro is becoming scarcer and scarcer in terms of growth of electrical load. Quebec is consuming lots more of its own hydro than it was before. We can provide significant capacity to avoid fossil peaking assets having to come online, and we can turn down our electrolytes. I mean, that is a winning business model, right? That is
I agree.
allows for new nuclear to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions we ask a bunch of our guests is if we had to build more tomorrow, what would we do? And I think you guys have answered that. You're like, well, we're doing it.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, well, let's ask the hard question, which is there anything that concerns you about energy or nuclear development in the coming years? And then hopefully leave us on an optimistic note. Where do you see this going in the future, and how can it help transform the future?
I think regulatory efficiency is one of those. The nuclear safety regulator plays a hugely important role, but figuring out how to create efficient pathways to allow for more rapid project delivery is very important. I think similarly, human resources development is critical globally, especially when you're starting to talk about going into new jurisdictions, not the US, not Canada, but into new places. Developing human resources to support that is very critical. So I think those are two things to watch. And obviously, wherever you are, stakeholder engagement is really important. I mean, even in a place like I worked on the financing for Baraka, and in the UAE, which is not a democracy, they did so much in terms of stakeholder engagement, in part to attract young Emiratis who were looking for a career that would normally go into the oil and gas sector. They want the best and the brightest to come into nuclear. So you want to create that excitement and that pipeline. That human resources piece is really important. Scaling the supply chain, also very important. So I think those are the things that we have to work on. I think the excitement is already there in terms of these themes of decarbonization and energy security. I think we're in a situation where there's going to be this moment of, we'll build it faster, deliver more quicker, because so many people want it today, and we can't do it today. It's going to take a little bit of time, but how can we be doing multiple projects at the same time with the people, with the supply chain, and mobilize that? Because I think it's very much a results-oriented focus of, we just need electricity. We're moving to a hydrogen economy. That's not going to mean anything unless you can scale it. And we haven't even talked about things like desalination, which is a huge growing need. And unless you do that cleanly and at scale, you're just going to create one problem while trying to serve another. And so I think if you think of nuclear as a tool, it is different than other things, and people need to appreciate what those differences are. But if you think about it as a tool for modern society to address the challenges we have, that I think is what gets exciting. And one last point, and I'll flip it back to Rishi, is the geopolitics of it all. When you think about the world we live in and how it's changed, being able for the OECD countries to be deploying these reactors to various places instead of Russian or Chinese deployments, that's also really important too. And that's again where you talk about governments being supportive. That whole geopolitical angle and the bilateral and multilateral relationships that are built around that is hugely important, maybe sadly so, but the world has changed and we have to recognize it, and nuclear plays a real part in all of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Rishi, what concerns you and what are you optimistic about?
What I'm concerned about is sort of the 68 talking points, anti-science, not based in any sort of realism, confusing what proliferation means, how unbelievably impossible it is to proliferate, or what waste means. It's not in canisters of green goo. These images are rearing themselves up again. And what concerns me is the nuclear industry not taking this opportunity to be unified and create real material that says, no, that's not true. Here's the truth. Here's how this works. And by the way, this waste is actually just unspent fuel that probably gets used. And to think that human ingenuity hasn't solved this, it has. We have solved how to do all of this stuff, right?
Yep.
So what I'm most excited about is a recognition of that we need a growth mentality, an abundance mentality. The earth can support everything we need to do with the population we have and a growing population if you let it. And this is literally energy from the gods, right? The uranium was created with two neutron stars colliding, and you don't want to use it? Can you imagine how ridiculous that is?
Yeah.
So
Excellent. Well, that's a fantastic way to end it. So Paul, Rishi, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me.
Thanks for doing it. Thanks for having us. Yeah.